Hello, everyone. Have you ever wondered what it would be like if the sun simply refused to shine during the warmest months of the year? Right now, as you listen to this story, I'm curious to know where you are and what time it is. It is fascinating to think about the diverse places and moments in which people might be sitting quietly, letting the same tale flow through their minds. Imagine, for instance, a world in which June feels more like November, and farmers look up at gray skies instead of golden sunlight, pondering how they will bring in their crops before frost destroys them entirely. This was exactly the world that existed in the year 1816, a year that would come to be known as the year without a summer, a year that altered lives, reshaped communities, and left its mark on history in ways both subtle and profound. It all began in the aftermath of a colossal eruption, one that occurred not in some distant, uninhabited region, but on the island of Java, thousands of miles from Europe and North America, yet capable of influencing weather across the entire northern hemisphere. Mount Tambora, a towering volcanic giant, had awakened from its slumber in April 1815, spewing immense clouds of ash and sulfur dioxide high into the stratosphere. These particles circled the globe, reflecting sunlight and lowering temperatures for months on end. The scientific understanding of such phenomena was rudimentary at best, yet people everywhere could feel the chilling effects as spring arrived but never quite managed to bring warmth. Crops withered in fields where wheat and corn should have stood tall. Gardens rotted before they could yield vegetables, and early frosts destroyed what little hope farmers had nurtured through the long winter. In the small villages scattered across New England, families awoke each morning to a sky perpetually shrouded in clouds, a sky that offered no reprieve from the chill. Mothers wrapped themselves in extra layers, nursing children who caught colds from the damp, cold air, while fathers trudged through mud-soaked fields, desperately trying to save what they could of their fragile crops. Rumors spread quickly, as they always did in tight-knit communities, about strange and unnatural phenomena. Reports of snow falling in June, frost-killed potatoes, and rivers that seemed to run slower, thicker, almost sluggish under the oppressive gray skies. Some claimed the world had been cursed, others speculated about the anger of God, while a few of the more scientifically curious whispered about the role of distant volcanoes, though without the proof we would have today, these ideas remained uncertain. Across the Atlantic, in Europe, the effects were equally unsettling. Switzerland's picturesque valleys, usually bustling with summer tourists and travelers, instead were quiet and damp. Farmers, struggling to harvest meager yields, could barely feed their families, and bread became scarce, prompting price surges that made even ordinary meals a daily worry. People huddled around hearths for warmth, sharing stories, gossip, and fears in candlelit rooms, where the scent of burning would mingle with the faint odor of spoiled vegetables and unripe fruit. Amidst this hardship, some sought solace in creativity. In Geneva, a young writer named Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, along with her companions, would later find inspiration during this gloomy summer for a story that, ironically, would come to haunt imaginations for generations. Though at the time, they were merely seeking ways to entertain themselves as the sun refused to rise above the mountains. Yet, the year without a summer was not only about human struggle. It was about adaptation, ingenuity, and the peculiar ways in which communities coped. In the American frontier, families experimented with alternative foods. Dandelion greens, roasted roots, and wild berries became vital supplements to diets that were failing under the pressure of frostbitten fields. Markets saw a surge in the sale of dried goods, salted meats, and preserved fruits, as households scrambled to stockpile any source of sustenance that might last through the months of scarcity. Meanwhile, in the cities, the plight of the poor grew more acute. Bread riots flared in some areas, fueled by frustration and desperation, while charitable organizations and religious groups struggled to feed growing numbers of people who faced malnutrition and sickness due to the prolonged cold. Even the natural world seemed affected in eerie ways. Reports from observers in New England and Europe described migratory birds arriving late or not at all, fish populations struggling in colder than normal rivers and lakes, and flowers blooming only briefly before succumbing to frost. The rhythm of life, usually dictated by predictable seasonal cycles, became erratic, forcing humans and animals alike into unfamiliar patterns of survival. People began to keep detailed journals, noting temperatures, crop failures, and unusual weather patterns, creating records that today allow historians to reconstruct the profound impact of this single climatic anomaly. These entries reveal more than just numbers. They tell stories of resilience, fear, humor, and occasional hope, of neighbors helping one another, of children learning to find joy even under gray skies, and of families finding inventive ways to keep warm, nourished, and sane amidst uncertainty. And so, as this tale unfolds, it is worth pausing to imagine yourself stepping into the shoes of someone living through that strange, cold, sunless summer, noticing the subtle ways it altered everyday life, how conversations shifted to discussions of weather and survival, how people adapted their routines and diets, and how the seemingly ordinary act of planting or harvesting became an anxious gamble against unseen forces in the sky. The world of 1816 was at once familiar and foreign, ordinary yet touched by a vast and invisible power that reminded everyone of their vulnerability to the whims of nature. It is within these moments, the frostbitten fields, the quiet homes, the wary smiles of neighbors, and the whispered rumors about distant volcanoes, that we begin to understand why this year has captured the imagination of so many, why it continues to be studied, and why it remains a haunting example of the delicate balance between humans and the environment around them. As the days dragged on through the unrelenting gray, communities that had once relied on the dependable rhythm of the seasons began to innovate, each in their own peculiar way, and the ingenuity of ordinary people became a quiet but powerful force against the stubborn chill that seemed to mock their efforts. In the rolling hills of Vermont, for example, farmers discovered that certain hardy root vegetables, previously considered secondary crops, were their most reliable allies in these harsh conditions. Carrots, turnips, and rutabagas, once planted mainly as fodder for livestock, were suddenly central to survival, dug from frozen or waterlogged soil with a mixture of urgency and reverence, as if each vegetable retrieved from the earth were a small victory against the indifferent sky. Families learned to roast these roots over open fires, mixing them with whatever small grains had survived, creating hearty stews that, while far from luxurious, provided essential sustenance and a sense of accomplishment in an otherwise unpredictable world. In nearby towns, the unusual weather inspired creative social gatherings, as communities sought ways to distract themselves from worry. Barn dances and evening meetings became more frequent, often held indoors, candlelight flickering against damp walls, echoing with laughter, music, and the occasional complaint about frostbitten crops or spoiled fruit. Children, unburdened by adult concerns, found unique entertainment in this altered world. They would run through puddle-filled streets, attempting to skate across frozen streams even in May, or build impromptu shelters and miniature snow forts in unusually persistent patches of frost that lingered far later than anyone expected. In one small Vermont village, an old clockmaker recounted to neighbors the rare phenomenon of ice forming in barrels of stored rainwater during a seemingly warm July afternoon, prompting gasps and nervous chuckles from the gathered families, all too aware of the precariousness of their situation. Meanwhile, rumors traveled faster than news ever could, shaping both hope and fear. In Pennsylvania, word spread of entire harvests ruined by an early frost that no one had predicted. Farmers traveled miles to trade goods, exchanging whatever grain or vegetables they had managed to salvage, often negotiating long into the night by lantern light, creating a network of barter and mutual assistance that was as much social as it was practical. In cities such as Boston and Philadelphia, the scarcity of fresh food drove inventive solutions among the urban poor. Preserved meats, Pickled vegetables and imported grains became lifelines. Street vendors, once selling familiar summer fare like fresh berries and peaches, adapted by offering dried fruits, nuts, and breads baked from whatever grains survived the relentless cold. Children walked barefoot to fetch water from frozen rivers, their cheeks red from wind and chill, while parents devised clever methods to keep fires burning longer, stacking wood in precise patterns to maximize warmth and minimize waste. Even across Europe, the chain reaction of cold, damp weather influenced not only agriculture but society in unexpected ways. In France, newspapers reported that villagers in mountainous regions had begun sewing extra layers into garments months earlier than usual, adding thick linings to jackets, skirts, and shirts, all while continuing their daily routines of tending livestock, milking cows, and chopping wood for heat. People kept meticulous notes about the weather, jotting down observations that ranged from temperature measurements to the timing of unusual frost and rain. These journals, often overlooked at the time, would centuries later provide invaluable insight for historians studying the global impact of volcanic eruptions on climate. Some families found creative solace in domestic activities, turning their homes into centers of entertainment and invention. Mothers experimented with baking recipes that accommodated spoiled or limited ingredients, inventing new dishes such as dents, filling breads with added roots or dried fruits, while fathers attempted to repair damaged tools and machinery using whatever scraps they could find. Children became apprentices not only to their parents' trades but also to survival itself, learning to ration food, predict weather by cloud patterns, and improvise in the face of constant uncertainty. A particularly memorable anecdote from this period tells of a young girl in a Pennsylvania village who, seeing frost on a green tomato, quickly buried it in a box of straw overnight, saving it from freezing and later serving it to her family. A small but vital triumph in a world suddenly defined by frost rather than sun. Interestingly, the cultural ramifications of the year extended beyond survival and domestic ingenuity. Artists and writers, confined indoors by relentless clouds and cold rains, turned their attention to reflection and imagination. Sketches of gray skies, wilted gardens, and snow-covered fields appeared alongside poems contemplating the fragility of human life when faced with nature's caprice. Letters sent between friends and relatives described not only the hardships but also the eerie beauty of the landscape. Mist rising over meadows that should have been golden with summer, rivers glinting coldly under a muted sun, and the strange stillness that seemed to permeate even bustling villages. Some reports even hinted at a kind of quiet inspiration, as the unusual weather prompted contemplations of mortality, perseverance, and the intricate relationship between humans and the natural world. By late summer, a pattern emerged. Despite the relentless cold, some farmers managed to harvest limited crops, and families who had learned to adapt were beginning to understand the delicate balance required to survive in such extraordinary circumstances. Communities that had previously relied on routine discovered the importance of flexibility, cooperation, and observation, while individuals found new appreciation for the ingenuity and resilience that ordinary life demanded in extraordinary times. Observers from distant cities noted with surprise that, even in the shadow of widespread famine and failing crops, life persisted, in ways both mundane and remarkable. Children still played in muddy streets, craftsmen continued their work, and neighbors helped one another to weather yet another day of gray skies and chilling winds. As the months stretched onward, the strange cold that gripped the northern hemisphere began to leave subtle marks on distant regions, influencing lives in ways both practical and peculiar. In the alpine valleys of Switzerland, shepherds faced the unnerving challenge of tending flocks when the grass, usually abundant and lush in summer, remained pale, thin, and frost-damaged. Goats and sheep grazed hesitantly, nibbling on what little vegetation could survive the relentless gray and damp, while herders trudged through sodden pastures, their boots heavy with mud and cold water seeping in from the frozen earth beneath. The thin air carried whispers of worry as older villagers recalled similar but far less severe events, comparing the current plight with tales handed down through generations, each recounting the fragility of crops, livestock, and human perseverance when nature intervened unexpectedly. In nearby Geneva, merchants who depended on summer trade found themselves improvising. The once bustling open markets, normally alive with vibrant fruit, fresh herbs, and colorful textiles, were subdued and sparse, prompting innovative solutions. Vendors began creating mixed bundles of dried goods, local cheeses, and smoked meats, carefully balancing what little supply survived with what could be procured from neighboring towns. Word of these bundles spread to surrounding villages, attracting travelers and curious buyers who saw these small adaptations not only as practical necessities, but also as glimpses into human ingenuity during hardship. Families from the countryside, often traveling on foot for hours, marveled at the organization of these markets, their children trailing behind, eyes wide at the assortment of colors and scents that persisted despite the gray skies above. Meanwhile, in France's Loire Valley, vintners faced a particularly unusual predicament. Vineyards, expecting the warmth of early summer to swell the grapes into rich clusters, found their fruit stunted, small, and unripe. Wine production, a craft both commercial and cultural, suffered heavily. Families that had relied on wine for income, trade, and social gatherings scrambled to salvage whatever grapes could ripen, experimenting with altered fermentation techniques to preserve flavor in a season that seemed to defy natural law. Conversations in taverns and salons were dominated by reports of poor harvests, unusual frost, and rumors of a distant volcanic eruption thought to be responsible for this widespread anomaly. Artists, writers, and intellectuals gathered to debate and speculate, their discussions often lingering late into candlelit nights, pondering the delicate balance between human endeavor and the whims of the natural world. Across the Atlantic in New England, a new layer of anxiety mingled with opportunity. Some families, realizing the severity of crop failures, turned to foraging with renewed intensity. Forests and riverbanks became sources of sustenance, as people collected wild berries, nuts, and edible roots, carefully sorting and storing them for weeks when fresh produce failed entirely. Fishermen noted unusual behaviors in fish populations, as the cold rivers slowed breeding cycles, leading to diminished catches, further challenging the delicate balance of survival. Villagers who had previously relied solely on cultivated crops now had to integrate these wild sources into their diets, learning to cook and preserve them in ways that had previously been considered unnecessary or inferior. Interestingly, the challenges of the year without a summer also shaped social and cultural practices in subtle ways. In one small town in Vermont, an informal gathering developed around evenings when families would share recipes for cooking with alternative ingredients. These gatherings, lit by lanterns and warmed by modest fireplaces, became a hub of community knowledge, storytelling, and even humor. One elder recounted with a grin how he had roasted wild roots over embers, seasoning them with little more than ash and a hint of salt, declaring the dish fit for a king of frost, much to the amusement of children who listened wide-eyed and hungry. These moments of ingenuity, humor, and shared resilience created bonds between neighbors that often lasted far beyond the harsh months of gray and cold. As the summer months dragged into late August, whispers of scientific curiosity began to take shape. Some natural philosophers and early meteorologists attempted to record patterns and speculate about causation, although the means to verify global impacts were limited. Observations of ash-colored skies, unusually cold temperatures, and persistent frost prompted notebooks filled with sketches, temperature notes, and anecdotal evidence from neighbors and travelers. A few daring individuals, inspired by curiosity and necessity, attempted to collect soil and water samples, comparing their findings with those from other regions, laying early groundwork for an understanding of climate patterns that would not be fully realized for decades. Meanwhile, families adjusted daily routines to cope with the persistent cold. In one Pennsylvania settlement, mothers began timing meals to coincide with moments of sunlight, however fleeting, allowing children brief warmth in their small, drafty homes. Fathers adapted work schedules, taking advantage of the slightly warmer midday hours to tend fields or repair structures damaged by the damp and frost. Children learned to entertain themselves with games that required minimal space and relied on imagination rather than sunlight, inventing stories, shadow plays, and makeshift toys from scraps of cloth and wood. These adaptations, both creative and practical, reveal how deeply the year without a summer influenced the rhythm of everyday life, encouraging resilience and resourcefulness in ways that would echo through family traditions for generations. Amid all of this, the wider world seemed strangely interconnected. Letters sent from distant towns, carried on horseback or by carriage, spread both warnings and news, creating informal networks of information that linked isolated villages to urban centers, and even across continents. In some cases, letters described desperate situations, failed harvests, and appeals for aid, while others recounted small triumphs. A stubborn patch of potatoes that survived frost, a clever method of food preservation, or a rare sunny afternoon that allowed children to play outdoors. These stories, a mixture of hope and hardship, demonstrate how communities and individuals alike navigated uncertainty, finding meaning and continuity even under the extraordinary circumstances imposed by the lingering cold. As the world continued to grapple with the lingering effects of the year without a summer, the unusual cold and erratic weather began to influence not only daily life but also migration patterns and economic choices across continents. In Ireland, where the damp, gray skies and relentless rainfall had replaced what should have been warm summer days, communities struggled with crops failing and potatoes rotting in the fields. For many families, the staple food they had relied on for generations suddenly became unreliable. Villagers traded stories of makeshift meals, some involving boiled roots, wild herbs, and even foraged mushrooms, and the scarcity drove both ingenuity and anxiety. The pressure on the poor was immense, prompting entire families to consider moving westward in search of better land and more predictable climates, planting the seeds of migration patterns that would later shape history. Meanwhile, in the mountains of Austria, the persistent frost had altered traditional patterns of work and leisure. Shepherds, finding their usual pastures barren, led their flocks to lower valleys, improvising grazing routes and constantly monitoring the health of their animals. Villagers used long, cold evenings to repair tools and clothing, while children, restless and energetic, created intricate indoor games using scraps of wood, leather, and cloth. In some households, older siblings took on responsibilities beyond their years, managing kitchens, tending fires, and caring for younger children, their childhoods accelerated by necessity yet imbued with creativity born of circumstance. Folk songs arose in this period, recounting the harshness of the cold summer, the resilience of communities, and the strange phenomena that seemed to redefine the very essence of life in 1816. Across the Atlantic, in New York and the surrounding countryside, farmers and traders experienced similar challenges, but with a different flavor of response. The unpredictable weather forced some to experiment with new crop varieties, often imported from other regions, testing hardier grains, alternative vegetables, and even unusual fruits that might withstand frost. Blacksmiths and carpenters found themselves crafting stoves, barrels, and storage containers designed specifically to preserve food against dampness and cold. Communities gathered in town halls, sharing advice, recipes, and rumors about weather patterns in distant Europe, while traveling merchants brought seeds, preserved goods, and news, acting as vital links in a world suddenly much more interconnected through shared hardship. In Switzerland, some families discovered that alpine springs provided a surprising source of warmth and nourishment. Hot mineral waters, often overlooked, became sites for small communal gatherings, where villagers would soak tired muscles and discuss the latest news or gossip about neighboring valleys. The interaction between natural resources and human adaptation became more pronounced than ever. Water that once served primarily for drinking and irrigation now played a role in social cohesion, creating spaces where ideas, observations, and local news circulated freely. Meanwhile, travelers and adventurers passing through the region noted the eerie beauty of frost-laden meadows under a muted sky, their diaries filled with descriptions that blended awe, curiosity, and subtle apprehension. In England, the unusual cold spurred both fear and fascination. Farmers in the Midlands noticed that certain crops, like cabbage and kale, seemed almost immune to frost, and experimental cultivation became a matter of survival and commerce. Local inns and taverns buzzed with discussion about alternative foods, home remedies for cold-related ailments, and the occasional tall tale of frost appearing in places where none should have been. Children, fascinated by the unnatural snow and ice during summer, invented games that mirrored the winter pastimes they had missed, creating small snowball fights and miniature sled races using scraps of wood and cloth. Even the aristocracy was affected. Estates that relied on gardens and orchards for both food and aesthetic beauty faced disappointment, prompting creative solutions, such as importing exotic fruits or relying more heavily on preserved goods and indoor entertainment. The year without a summer also left subtle yet profound marks on scientific inquiry and curiosity. Observatories in cities like Paris and London documented sunspots, cloud formations, and temperature fluctuations with a new urgency. Amateur naturalists, motivated by both necessity and fascination, kept detailed diaries of plant behavior, frost patterns, and animal activity, inadvertently creating early datasets that would later inform meteorology and climate science. Conversations over breakfast tables, in candlelit parlors, and in university halls frequently touched on the relationship between volcanic eruptions, atmospheric changes, and global weather patterns. Although understanding remained incomplete, the collective curiosity and meticulous observation of ordinary people and scholars alike planted seeds of knowledge that would grow in importance over the following decades. Meanwhile, households everywhere adapted in personal, inventive ways. In a small Austrian village, a baker discovered that adding certain roots and dried fruits to his loaves created filling, nutritious bread that could withstand the damp and cold longer than traditional recipes. In the American frontier, a mother taught her children to layer straw and leaves beneath potatoes to prevent them from freezing, a technique passed down from one family to another. Across towns and villages, neighbors shared remedies, recipes, and strategies, forming informal networks of knowledge and support that softened the blow of the unusually harsh season. Even the mundane routines of fetching water, chopping wood, and preparing meals became infused with improvisation and subtle creativity, each household discovering unique solutions to common problems. Social and cultural life, though challenged by the cold and gray skies, continued to thrive in adapted forms. Music, storytelling, and small theatrical performances took place indoors, where children and adults alike could gather without braving the frost. Letters, journals, and newspapers chronicled the unusual weather, blending practical advice with reflection, humor, and occasional poetry. Communities became more attentive to one another, sharing news of weather patterns, crop survival, and inventive strategies to cope with the unusual summer. Even seemingly trivial observations, such as the early bloom of a stubborn flower or the survival of a frost-prone vegetable, carried deep significance, sparking conversations and quiet celebrations. As the unusual summer slowly advanced toward its final months, its chilling influence stretched into regions not yet fully touched by the shock of frost and failing crops, creating ripples of anxiety, adaptation, and curiosity in places as diverse as the American Midwest, Scandinavia, and the Italian countryside. In the heartlands of Ohio, settlers who had only recently arrived on newly cleared farmland watched their dreams of abundant harvests teeter on the edge of disaster. Cornfields, which should have been green and full of promise, grew pale and stunted under endless gray skies, while early frosts blackened what little grain had managed to emerge. Families, often relying on a single year's crop to sustain them through harsh winters, scrambled to ration supplies, roasting whatever root vegetables and preserved meats they could salvage, teaching children early lessons about scarcity and ingenuity. Further north, in the fjords of Norway, fishermen and coastal communities faced challenges of an entirely different kind. The unusual cold, coupled with incessant rain, altered fish behavior in rivers and along the coast, reducing catches of cod and herring, the staples of both diet and trade. Villagers experimented with new fishing techniques, crafting improvised nets and altering their timing to take advantage of shifts in fish migration. Kitchens became workshops of preservation, smoking, salting, and drying fish to ensure survival over the long, gray months. Children, bundled in woolen layers, learned to assist in these tasks, running messages between boats and homes, and gaining knowledge of the delicate balance between human life and the cycles of nature. In Italy, the gentle warmth that normally characterized summer in Tuscany was replaced by persistent drizzle and cold, prompting vintners and orchard owners to take desperate measures. Grapes and olives, essential to both local diets and commerce, grew small and shriveled under gray clouds, and families experimented with early harvesting and fermentation techniques, attempting to salvage both wine and oil. Along the narrow streets of Florence and Siena, the damp weather created a peculiar blend of smell and atmosphere, with smoke mingled with wet earth and the faint scent of spoiled fruits, an olfactory reminder that survival required both vigilance and creativity. Market stalls adjusted accordingly, featuring more preserved foods, dried fruits, and heavily spiced dishes designed to compensate for the lack of fresh produce. Meanwhile, the social fabric of communities continued to adapt to the lingering chill. In small American towns, gatherings shifted indoors, with families hosting storytelling evenings, musical performances, and educational lessons that could be conducted by candlelight. Children, restless and inventive, created games that mirrored the natural world they could no longer freely explore, crafting miniature rivers, mountains, and fields from clay, wood, and scraps of fabric. Adults exchanged knowledge in these gatherings, discussing both practical survival strategies and philosophical reflections on humanity's vulnerability to forces far beyond daily control. The unusual weather sparked debates over human ingenuity, morality, and the potential of scientific understanding, even among those with limited formal education. News of distant events and experiences traveled widely, carried by merchants, travelers, and letters. In one striking example, a merchant from Boston relayed accounts of frost appearing in Switzerland in July, while European newspapers circulated reports of failed harvests in the American Midwest. These stories created a subtle sense of interconnectedness, linking communities separated by thousands of miles through shared experience and collective observation of nature's unpredictability. Ordinary citizens became inadvertent scientists, noting weather patterns, crop conditions, and animal behavior, adding to a growing body of knowledge that, while incomplete, reflected humanity's innate curiosity and resilience. At the same time, domestic life adapted in creative ways. In a New England household, mothers experimented with multi-layered cooking methods, combining scarce grains with wild greens, root vegetables, and preserved fruits to produce filling, nutritious meals. Fathers repaired fences, roofs, and tools with makeshift materials, ensuring that homes and livestock could endure the extended period of damp and cold. Children learned practical skills such as starting fires with damp wood, weaving straw into insulating mats, and improvising storage for perishable goods. Even seemingly mundane acts, fetching water, chopping wood, preparing meals, became exercises in ingenuity, reflecting the subtle but profound ways in which human life adjusted to an unpredictable environment. Cultural responses continued to evolve alongside practical adaptations. In Scandinavia, small theaters and salons hosted storytelling and music sessions designed to entertain families confined indoors, blending folklore with contemporary reflection on the unusual weather. In Italy, poets and painters drew inspiration from frost-covered vineyards and gray skies, capturing the eerie beauty of a summer that should have been warm and golden. Families recorded these experiences in journals and letters, creating rich archives of anecdotal evidence, humor, and reflection, all framed within the unique circumstances of the year without a summer. As the lingering chill of 1816 stretched across the northern hemisphere, its effects reached even more distant lands, shaping daily life in ways both subtle and dramatic. In the mountainous regions of Japan, where rice paddies usually thrived under warm summer sun, farmers noticed their fields remaining waterlogged and cool, the young rice shoots failing to grow at their usual pace. Families, reliant on their summer harvests for survival and trade, became increasingly inventive, creating temporary shelters for crops, layering soil with straw to retain warmth, and carefully rotating water in paddies to prevent frost damage. Children assisted by carrying small baskets of straw and observing the delicate shoots, their laughter echoing over terraces that would otherwise have hummed with the sound of thriving agriculture. Meanwhile, in the southern United States, plantations and small farms faced a mixture of challenge and adaptation. Cotton plants, cornfields, and vegetable gardens grew unevenly under gray skies, and planters experimented with staggered planting schedules and novel irrigation methods, attempting to coax life from the stubborn earth. Families spent long hours tending to the delicate balance of soil, moisture, and sunlight, often improvising with whatever materials were at hand. Kitchens adapted to the scarcity of summer vegetables, with mothers combining root vegetables, salted meats, and preserved fruits into dense, nourishing dishes, while children assisted by collecting firewood, tending small livestock, and learning essential survival skills under the guidance of their elders. In Central Europe, particularly in Hungary and the Czech lands, communities faced the dual challenge of failing crops and social unrest. Villagers gathered in small groups to share news, barter scarce resources, and exchange advice on alternative foods and protective agricultural techniques. Markets reflected the precariousness of the season. Bundles of dried herbs, salted meats, and preserved grains dominated the stalls, while unusual items such as smoked roots, pickled vegetables, and newly experimented fermentation products attracted curious buyers. Conversations were filled with stories of frost in June, snow in July, and reports of strange atmospheric phenomena, all of which fueled both fear and fascination among the populace. Even the natural world seemed caught in a prolonged state of unease. In North America, migratory birds arrived late or in diminished numbers, altering the delicate balance of ecosystems and impacting local hunting and farming practices. Fish, sensitive to temperature fluctuations, became harder to catch, prompting fishermen to explore new techniques, timing, and locations for their nets and traps. Observant villagers and naturalists documented these anomalies meticulously, creating handwritten logs that included temperature readings, weather patterns, and unusual animal behavior. Such records, often shared with neighbors or visiting merchants, formed an informal network of climate observation that spanned towns, valleys, and even continents. Meanwhile, cultural adaptations continued to flourish in response to the unusual summer. In the Italian countryside, families found solace and amusement in small festivals held indoors or under temporary shelters. Music, storytelling, and local theater became central to community life, blending humor, education, and reflection on the hardships imposed by the relentless gray skies. Children created miniature landscapes with clay, wood, and straw, mimicking farms, rivers, and forests that had been altered by frost, learning to appreciate both the fragility and resilience of nature. Adults exchanged recipes, tools, and strategies for coping with the prolonged cold, forming social bonds that were as much about emotional support as practical survival. In Scandinavia, communities near the Arctic Circle observed some of the most unusual phenomena. Rivers that normally flowed steadily slowed under unexpected ice formations, while early snow fell sporadically, confusing both humans and wildlife. Hunters and gatherers adapted by altering routes, storing game differently, and improvising shelters from timber and moss to protect both themselves and animals from the persistent chill. Families developed intricate routines to maximize warmth indoors, layering clothing, using insulated bedding, and experimenting with small hearths that burned more efficiently, conserving fuel while providing comfort against the damp cold. Across the Atlantic, in New England, the persistence of the gray skies and frost prompted a renewed interest in community gatherings. Residents held informal knowledge-sharing sessions, discussing innovative methods for food preservation, crop protection, and domestic efficiency. Children continued to invent games and educational activities that could be conducted indoors, learning practical skills while maintaining a sense of wonder and creativity despite the bleak environment outside. Observers noted how humor and resilience became tools of psychological survival, as families and neighbors found small joys even amid scarcity and uncertainty. As September unfolded, the chill and gloom that had defined 1816 continued to ripple across distant lands, producing a mosaic of human adaptation, curiosity, and subtle cultural shifts. In the highlands of Peru, where the Andean terraces usually basked in sunlight, farmers noticed an unusual early frost creeping across potato fields that had already been planted for months. Villagers, familiar with the rhythms of the mountains, were nonetheless surprised by this anomaly. They hastily covered young shoots with straw and stones, improvised small greenhouses from reeds and mud, and organized communal efforts to share food and labor, knowing that survival depended not only on individual ingenuity but also on collective diligence. Children, often enlisted to assist in gathering straw and water, found themselves learning lessons in responsibility far earlier than expected, their games and chores entwined with the rhythms of necessity. Meanwhile, in the northern reaches of China, the Yangtze River Basin experienced unusually cool temperatures and persistent rain, delaying harvests and altering traditional routines. Rice farmers adjusted irrigation schedules, rotated planting areas, and experimented with protective coverings, while families prepared stews, porridges, and preserved vegetables to stretch limited supplies. Markets reflected the scarcity of fresh produce, and local vendors became adept at combining limited ingredients into filling, nutritious meals that could sustain households through weeks of uncertain weather. Stories circulated among neighbors of frost in July, rice paddies submerged in cold water, and unusual animal behaviors, all contributing to a growing sense of awe and anxiety about the unpredictability of nature. In Brazil, where coffee plantations thrived under tropical warmth, the unusual global cooling produced curious effects. Flowering patterns in certain crops shifted, rainfall became sporadic yet intense, and planters experimented with staggered harvesting and innovative drying techniques. Families adapted by storing excess grains and beans in improvised containers to protect against dampness and spoilage. Children played along riverbanks, their games altered by unexpected cool currents and occasional rain, learning early to read the subtle signals of nature that dictated both survival and prosperity. Artisans and local merchants noted the changes with interest, adjusting trade practices and crafting goods suitable for the altered season. Across the Atlantic, in rural New England, peculiar atmospheric phenomena became the subject of fascination and conversation. Morning fogs lingered longer than usual, rain fell unpredictably, and frost appeared sporadically on unshaded crops. Residents observed these events meticulously, recording temperature, wind direction, and crop conditions in journals or letters to friends and relatives. Scientific curiosity intertwined with necessity, as ordinary families became amateur meteorologists, documenting unusual weather while simultaneously striving to ensure their own survival. The interplay of observation, experimentation, and adaptation strengthened both communal bonds and individual problem-solving skills, creating networks of knowledge that would endure far beyond the immediate crisis. In Austria, townspeople experienced an almost surreal layering of atmospheric oddities. Early snow dusted mountain peaks even as valleys remained gray and damp. Rivers swelled with meltwater and persistent rain, and unpredictable frost threatened both orchards and vineyards. Families, improvising with what materials were available, created insulated storage spaces for food, crafted layered clothing for warmth, and developed creative domestic routines that balanced work and survival with moments of leisure. Children, curious and adaptable, learned to replicate miniature farms, rivers, and gardens indoors, honing skills that blended creativity with practical understanding of their altered environment. These exercises, often playful and inventive, served as both education and entertainment, reinforcing lessons in resilience and observation. Meanwhile, cultural life persisted despite the persistent chill. In small Italian towns, families held indoor festivals to celebrate whatever could survive the unusual summer. Music, storytelling, and communal cooking took on new significance, blending entertainment with practical education on how to cope with the climate. In Scandinavia, informal gatherings of neighbors allowed for knowledge sharing, particularly regarding fishing strategies, preservation techniques, and agricultural improvisation. People discovered joy and camaraderie in adapting to constraints, and the unusual summer became a catalyst for both social cohesion and inventive problem-solving. Across continents, letters and news circulated more widely than ever, spreading accounts of frost in Europe, delayed harvests in North America, and curious phenomena in South America and Asia. Merchants and travelers acted as conduits of information, carrying news of crop failures, atmospheric anomalies, and survival strategies from one region to another. These communications fostered an early sense of global awareness, illustrating how human communities, though physically separated, could learn from and support one another in navigating extraordinary environmental challenges. As the strange and persistent chill of 1816 extended its subtle influence, life in regions far from the usual centers of European observation experienced unusual rhythms and challenges. In the Ethiopian Highlands, farmers and herders noted a delayed growing season, with barley and teff sprouting slowly beneath a sky that seemed more somber than in any memory. Villagers improvised with simple greenhouses made of sticks, cloth, and mud, protecting tender shoots from unexpected frosts and damp winds. Families gathered in stone-walled homes, often lit by small oil lamps, discussing the progress of crops and sharing strategies for extending the storage of grains. Children, curious and eager, ran errands for elders, collected firewood, or experimented with small crafts using leftover materials, learning practical lessons about endurance and observation in the harsh environment. Meanwhile, in the sprawling plains of Russia, communities experienced a perplexing combination of unseasonal frost and persistent cloud cover. Wheat fields that should have been golden and full were pale, thin, and vulnerable to decay. Farmers, aware that any miscalculation could lead to famine, relied heavily on careful observation of frost patterns, wind direction, and river levels. Villagers convened small meetings to discuss rationing, the timing of harvests, and the sharing of surplus with those less fortunate. Markets in nearby towns reflected the scarcity. Bundles of dried grains, smoked meats, and salted fish dominated stalls, while unusual trades developed, such as bartering hand-knitted clothing or firewood for staple food. Families adapted daily routines to maximize the short periods of sunlight, adjusting work hours in the fields, tending livestock, and performing domestic tasks in a rhythm dictated by nature rather than the clock. In North Africa, particularly in the Atlas Mountains and Moroccan Highlands, local communities noted cooler and wetter conditions than usual. Crops such as barley, lentils, and fruits were affected, prompting creative solutions. Villagers created irrigation channels to redirect rainfall, built small shelters for young trees, and experimented with storing harvests in underground pits to protect them from unexpected moisture. Daily life involved a careful balancing act. Mothers cooked meals with available ingredients, often substituting grains and legumes for missing vegetables, while children helped tend animals, collect water, and transport goods to the central marketplace. Stories circulated of frost-like damage in surprisingly high-altitude areas, and curiosity about these unusual conditions became a topic of communal discussion, blending practical concern with fascination. In the Balkans, including regions of modern-day Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania, villagers faced an equally unusual summer. Vineyards, orchards, and grain fields struggled under gray skies, sporadic frost, and persistent dampness. Farmers improvised protective coverings for vines, rotated crops to maximize survival, and engaged in barter to supplement diets. Families adapted their homes for warmth, layering clothing, bedding, and firewood to withstand the pervasive chill. Children, unable to play outdoors as freely as in previous summers, invented indoor games that mimicked natural cycles, constructing miniature rivers, gardens, and farm animals from clay, straw, and scraps of wood. These imaginative activities served as both entertainment and subtle education, instilling an awareness of environmental patterns and human resourcefulness. Meanwhile, unusual atmospheric phenomena continued to captivate observers. In some high-altitude regions of Eastern Europe, rare snowfalls occurred even in mid-July, creating a surreal backdrop for daily life. Cloud formations often appeared with an eerie yellow or ash-colored tint, likely caused by distant volcanic activity, prompting speculation and storytelling among villagers. Elders recounted memories of unusual summers past, comparing them to this one, while children asked endless questions about the strange colors, unexpected frost, and delayed harvests. Folk tales and local legends began to absorb elements of this extraordinary year, blending natural observation with imaginative narrative, creating cultural artifacts that would linger long after the cold finally receded. Social life, though constrained by weather, adapted in creative ways. In small towns across Eastern Europe and North Africa, communal gatherings focused on storytelling, music, and shared meals, often held indoors or under temporary shelters. These gatherings became opportunities to exchange knowledge about agricultural techniques, preservation methods, and survival strategies. Humor and camaraderie provided relief from anxiety, with families celebrating small successes. A patch of vegetables that survived frost, a newly discovered method for keeping firewood dry, or an improvised cooking technique that sustained the household. Such moments of shared triumph fostered cohesion, teaching both young and old that adaptability, observation, and cooperation were as critical as labor and skill. As the final weeks of what should have been a warm summer approached, the strange cold of 1816 continued to ripple through both familiar and distant lands, producing subtle yet profound effects on daily life, culture, and human perception of nature. In the rolling hills of Canada's eastern provinces, settlers confronted a landscape that seemed out of rhythm with the calendar. Fields of corn, wheat, and barley grew slowly, their pale green stalks drooping under gray skies, while sudden frosts in June and July left seedlings damaged and uncertain. Families, reliant on the labor of both adults and children, improvised with coverings, careful watering, and staggered planting techniques, attempting to coax life from stubborn soil. Children, often enlisted in these efforts, carried water, stacked straw, and learned the delicate balance between observation and action, their play intertwined with lessons in resilience. Meanwhile, in the tropical lowlands of Colombia and Venezuela, unusual cool spells combined with persistent cloud cover disrupted typical agricultural cycles. Coffee and cocoa plantations experienced delayed flowering, while fruit trees produced smaller yields than anticipated. Local farmers experimented with shading techniques, relocating seedlings, and altering irrigation schedules, while families adapted meals to incorporate more preserved grains, beans, and root vegetables. In small villages, communal kitchens and markets became central hubs for exchanging both food and knowledge, creating informal networks of survival strategy that strengthened social cohesion and fostered creative problem-solving. In the Great Lakes region of North America, fishermen and hunters noted shifts in animal behavior. Fish moved in unusual patterns, migrating later or in different numbers, while migratory birds arrived off-schedule or avoided familiar feeding grounds. Families adapted by exploring new fishing locations, adjusting hunting routines, and learning to preserve what they caught more efficiently. Winter preparations began unusually early, as settlers recognized that the scarcity of summer crops would directly affect their ability to endure the coming months. Children assisted by gathering firewood, watching livestock, and helping preserve food, acquiring skills that were at once practical, instructive, and formative. Further south, in the Andean regions of Bolivia and Peru, villagers contended with both unseasonal frost and heavy rainfall. Terraced fields, a centuries-old method for efficient cultivation, required constant attention as waterlogged soil threatened to erode under heavy precipitation. Farmers worked with families and neighbors to reinforce terraces, redirect water, and protect tender crops with improvised shelters of reeds, clay, and straw. At the same time, small communal gatherings emerged in village squares and homes, where residents shared knowledge about crop protection, food preservation, and strategies for coping with the unpredictable weather. These gatherings provided both practical guidance and social support, fostering resilience through collaboration. In the United States Appalachian Mountains, unusual frosts and prolonged gray skies created a challenging environment for subsistence farming. Families experimented with layered crop planting, tried alternative vegetables, and relied heavily on preserved foods. Kitchens adapted by combining whatever ingredients were available into dense, filling meals, while indoor activities occupied children who could no longer play freely outdoors. Storytelling, music, and indoor games became essential for both education and entertainment, blending practical skill building with moments of joy and imagination. Adults exchanged tips for keeping livestock healthy, preserving food, and managing limited firewood supplies, creating informal knowledge networks that strengthened community cohesion. In Mexico, where climate typically allowed for bountiful harvests, reports of cooler temperatures and erratic rainfall led to cautious experimentation among farmers. Maize, beans, and chili plants produced inconsistently, prompting villagers to adjust planting schedules and storage methods. Families shared resources and advice, ensuring that the scarcity of one crop could be compensated by another. Children participated by helping with chores and observing changes in plant growth, learning through practical engagement how weather could influence survival and success. Even small celebrations, such as communal meals or music gatherings, took on new significance, emphasizing cooperation, gratitude, and adaptability. Meanwhile, scientific curiosity and observation continued to grow. Travelers, merchants, and scholars carried letters, reports, and journals across continents, noting unusual cloud formations, unexpected frosts, and altered animal behaviors. Observatories and urban centers recorded temperature fluctuations and sunspot activity, while local naturalists compiled anecdotal data from farms and villages. This combination of formal and informal observation created a patchwork of early climate documentation, blending practical knowledge with the beginnings of systematic inquiry. Families and communities, though focused on survival, unwittingly contributed to a broader understanding of the interconnectedness of weather, agriculture, and human society. By early October, the cumulative effects of the year without a summer had left visible marks on landscapes, routines, and human consciousness. Communities had grown closer, sharing knowledge, resources, and emotional support. Families had developed inventive approaches to food, shelter, and daily work, and children had absorbed lessons in observation, creativity, and resilience. Even as some regions began to glimpse a return to normal seasonal patterns, the memory of frost in July, persistent gray skies, and delayed harvests lingered, quietly shaping cultural practices, survival strategies, and the collective awareness of humanity's delicate relationship with the natural world. As October deepened, the lingering cold and erratic weather of 1816 continued to ripple through the world, shaping daily routines, agricultural practices, and social life in ways that were both subtle and profound. In the Sahel region of Africa, where communities relied on seasonal rains to sustain millet and sorghum crops, the unusually cool temperatures slowed growth and altered traditional planting schedules. Farmers improvised with carefully spaced irrigation, temporary shelters for young plants, and communal coordination to protect fields from unexpected frost at night. Families relied on shared knowledge, exchanging advice on which crops were hardier and which could be stored safely for longer periods. Children played nearby, learning early about the rhythms of planting and harvest while improvising games using clay, sticks, and woven grass. Their play intertwined with practical observation of the natural world. In the highlands of India, unusual rain patterns and persistent gray skies disrupted rice paddies, sugarcane fields, and vegetable gardens. Farmers adjusted irrigation channels, experimented with planting times, and created small protective coverings for the most delicate seedlings. Villagers gathered for evening meals, where stories, advice, and strategies were exchanged, blending practical instruction with humor and reflection. Kitchens adapted to scarcity, with mothers combining grains, legumes, and preserved vegetables into nutrient-rich dishes, often teaching children recipes that balanced sustenance with ingenuity. Markets in small towns reflected the scarcity. Dried grains, salted vegetables, and preserved foods dominated stalls, while merchants traveled further afield to bring unusual ore. Meanwhile, in Morocco and Algeria, cooler temperatures and intermittent frost altered traditional agricultural cycles. Olive trees, barley fields, and fruit orchards produced smaller yields, prompting families to store and ration food carefully. Children assisted in chores, collecting firewood, tending small livestock, and learning how to recognize the signs of frost or disease in plants. Elders shared stories of unusual summers past, comparing current conditions to memories and legends, fostering both education and a sense of shared history. The adaptation extended beyond agriculture. Households experimented with heating methods, layering fabrics and optimizing hearth placement to maximize warmth indoors. In Central Asia, including regions around the Tian Shan and Pamir Mountains, herding communities observed changes in pastures and snowfall patterns. Grazing routes shifted as frost appeared unexpectedly, prompting herders to improvise new paths and protective measures for livestock. Families relied on preserved grains, dried meat, and dairy products to sustain themselves during prolonged periods of inclement weather. Children, often accompanying adults on daily rounds, absorbed knowledge of animal care, forage patterns, and environmental observation, gaining a deep understanding of how weather, land, and survival intertwined. Folk songs and stories began to reflect the unusual climate, capturing the eerie beauty of frost-touched landscapes and the resilience of people who navigated them. Even in urban centers, the effects of the year without a summer were evident. Markets and streets were quieter than usual, with merchants adapting their offerings to account for both scarcity and consumer demand. Artisans experimented with alternative materials, combining practicality with creativity, while indoor entertainment, music, theater, storytelling, became increasingly important for maintaining morale. Families spent long evenings indoors, sewing, crafting, cooking, or exchanging news and observations. Children learned practical skills alongside games that mirrored natural processes, blending play, education, and adaptation into daily life. Across the globe, scientific and observational curiosity continued to grow. In China, India, Africa, and Europe, scholars and ordinary people alike meticulously recorded temperature, rainfall, crop performance, and unusual natural phenomena. Letters and journals circulated widely, spreading knowledge and creating informal networks of early meteorological observation. While understanding remained limited, these efforts reflected a growing human desire to interpret, adapt to, and, where possible, predict the forces of nature. Communities relied on both empirical observation and anecdotal knowledge, blending practical survival with curiosity and reflection. By the middle of October, the year without a summer had reshaped human experience across multiple continents. Families had developed creative solutions for agriculture, preservation, and household management. Communities had strengthened bonds through cooperation and knowledge sharing, and children had learned the subtleties of observation, adaptation, and environmental awareness. Even as sunlight lengthened and temperatures slowly approached seasonal norms, the lessons of 1816 lingered. Resilience, ingenuity, and collaboration had proven essential, while the fragile interplay between humanity and nature had become deeply apparent. The unusual summer left an indelible mark on daily life, cultural practices, and the collective consciousness, quietly shaping approaches to survival, community, and understanding of the natural world for years to come.